sort of fans that may be cynics and may believe that the kind of fan ownership model doesn't really work. Obviously, would you point to, as you mentioned before, would you point to clubs like Bayern Munich and Borussia Dortmund as prime examples of why it can work? And I did a little bit of reading on it. Do they work on something called the 50+1% model or something like that? Is that something ultimately in a kind of MUST utopia? Is that something that you'd be striving towards?
Yeah, I mean, almost always when I meet people who think they object, it's because they're objecting to something different from what we're proposing, really. I mean, they think either that we want to run the club ourselves, that we want some kind of position, we want some kind of power, and for me, it's absolutely the opposite, because I would actually be concerned if there was a supporters organisation that was controlling the club, because what that would create is an horrendous political battle. There are people who would love to to have more control over the club, and I wouldn't like to see that battle, because it just creates a division amongst the fans. And so the sort of structure I'd like to see might be something more like a 25% of the shares held in some form of trust, which are never going to be sold, and that's your blocking stake to prevent anyone ever getting full control of the club. And then maybe 35%, that sort of number, might be a commercial investor who's looking for a return, or a group of them. So they would probably dictate day-to-day policy, but if they start to do things that are in their interest and not in the club or the fans' interest, they can be outvoted, because the other portion of the shares would be held by individual fans, and so that would be over the 50% threshold. And I think actually in this model, you need to be substantially over the 50% threshold to be safe. And so you might be looking at something more like 65% owned by fans plus a trust.
Right. Sort of just returning to the club very quickly. Obviously, have you been part of the MUST, or was it Suam originally? Have you been part of it since its inception?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've kind of had an idea of the dealings with the club right from the beginning. Obviously, sort of 98, 99, we win the treble. We're already becoming a major global brand by that stage. Once Fergie had really sort of imposed his reign, and we were very successful. So I imagine the club was already becoming more corporate and sort of difficult to deal with in terms of bureaucracy. But during your existence, sort of 15 years you've existed, has that just become increasingly so in terms of actually dealing with the juggernaut that is MUFC?
I mean, the odd thing is, actually, I would say that the PLC was the best model that we've had. Better than Edwards, better than the private ownership Edwards, I mean. It was where we first got proper dialogue. We first got to a situation where we could talk at board level, because we were shareholders, and they didn't want people coming and asking awkward questions at AGMs and so on. So that created an incentive for them to have a dialogue with us. We started doing things like tabling resolutions at the AGM, and as soon as we did that, they immediately said, let's talk, because they didn't want us doing that, because it made them look bad. If we tabled a resolution that was then passed by the shareholders, that doesn't look good on your board if they haven't thought of doing that. And one example of that was we proposed having a scrip dividend, which means that instead of taking your money, your dividend in cash, you can take it in new shares or extra shares. So in other words, the club doesn't pay the cash out. You get shares in instead of cash. And actually the idea would have been, of course, that we actually got new shares, so that the club doesn't actually pay any cash at all. But what they did was they did a scrip dividend where it was paid as cash, but then used to buy shares in the market. So it would boost the share price, which they liked. But for us, it meant that all the fans who subscribed to that model were gradually increasing their shareholding and not taking the dividend in cash. And they agreed to do that only after we put that forward as a resolution. So, yes, the club became more commercial under PLC versus the private ownership. But I don't think it was a bad thing, actually. I think that generally there was an improvement there. It is a balance, and if you're pushing it too hard and becoming too commercial, it feels like the name's been kind of hoarded around the world, and that diminishes the reputation and what we like to think of as our football club. As you'll be aware, in Barcelona for a long time they didn't have a sponsor on the shirt, and they're very proud of that. And they did that because it was kind of meant to send a message, you know, that it's more important, more than a club, they say, don't they? But, you know, I think we're realistic about that. We realise that we want to allow the club to earn commercial revenues. It's mainly about what you do with them and about reinvesting them and not exploiting supporters. If you can generate sponsorship monies, great. You know, so for me, the PLC was the most transparent model. It was actually, you know, the most successful in our history at that time. And the private model, I think, has been awful, because you look at the cost to the club. Once we're in private, once we can't see the finances, the amount of money that's gone out of the club over the years, and, you know, with the remaining debt, it will be more than £1 billion it's cost us for the Glazer takeover in the end. And so I think the PLC was by far the best model, and in a way what we were talking about in terms of the ideal model, it is a kind of a PLC, but it's not a straightforward PLC. It's a public company where the majority of the shares are owned by funds, with a blocking stake owned by a trust. And I think that probably is the optimum model for a UK club anyway, I would say, or an English club.
To non-economically minded Reds, obviously there's been a couple of years ago the Glazers floated a share of the club on the New York Stock Exchange. I'm not particularly economically minded myself, but I know a little bit about it. But could you just sort of slightly expand upon the kind of nuances of that and what it actually means and its implications?
Yeah, I mean, we supported the idea of a flotation if it met certain criteria, and sadly we weren't at all surprised to find that it didn't when they eventually came around to it. We had been pre-briefed by people inside the club that said, yeah, they're going to use it to pay down the debt, and we thought, well, we can't argue against that, even though we'd rather the Glazers paid their own debt. If they were selling some shares in order to do that, then, you know, there was no objection to that, and it was good for the club. But when it came to it, what they did was kind of the worst of all worlds, really, because first of all they floated outside the UK, which meant that there was less regulation in terms of transparency and things like that. They moved the company to the Cayman Islands, which meant there are no AGMs, and very little information comes out about what's going on with the finances of the club. And then they created this really iniquitous model of shares where you've got an A and B class shares, and the A class shares actually have one vote per share, so they aren't like normal ordinary shares, and those are the ones that were floated on the market. But then the B class shares, which the Glazers hold on to, have 10 votes per share. So what it means, of course, is they could sell effectively 90% of the shares and still control the club. At the moment they still own 90% of the shares anyway. 10% were floated on the market, and what they did then was they didn't issue them as new shares so that the club was actually going to receive the money. They issued half as new shares and sold half of their own shares as well, so they got the money. So it was another issue where basically they were taking money, and the club did get some benefit, but they also charged all the costs of the IPO onto the club, so they got their money free and the club paid for the benefit of having some money. So I think it was a massive missed opportunity. I think that the structure of it meant that it was meaningless for funds to buy shares, because even if we managed to buy 10% of the shares at $300 million or whatever the exact price would have been at the time, you'd have about 1.8% voting rights, utterly meaningless. And so there was no point in buying shares at that time. I can see that an argument for buying a token share if you want to say I'm a shareholder in Manchester United, but no more than one, because otherwise, you know, if all the United fans started buying shares now in any significant number, all you're doing is pushing the share price up, because there's so little liquidity in the shares. You know, so few shares traded that anyone buying shares is having a significant influence, and so, you know, there's no point in United fans buying into the IPO in my view, and there still isn't now. But if we can get the change, if they decide to float some more shares, and I'd hope they will do, then I can see there being an opportunity to do something different. And I certainly think, I mean, we've just had a filing last week, or even this week I think, that said that they were going to be using the 75 million revolving credit facility, which would mean that effectively they're going to take on more debt on a temporary basis. It's an overdraft effectively, in order to make more funds available for the transfer budget, or at least that's what's being told.
Right.
That's fine, but for us, we're floating on the stock market. why don't you issue some new shares? Because that is the cheapest form of credit you can get, basically. They could issue new shares, the club issues new shares, the club gets the proceeds, the club can use that money. And that wouldn't seem unreasonable to me for fans to buy into that to an extent. But obviously I wouldn't feel that there's any point in buying any significant amount until we've got a situation where you can actually have some kind of influence. And so that's the balance really that we've got to strike. That's why we've got a difficulty with any kind of potential exit for the Glazers is at what point are they going to give anybody else the opportunity, if they're prepared to put the money up, to get a majority or 100% stake.
Right. So obviously it was kind of big news just around the turn of the year that the valuation of the shares had dropped significantly already during the Moyes tenure. So sort of according to what you just said there, it sort of doesn't really make a great deal of difference to what you're proposing anyway, does it? Because you weren't proposing for people to purchase the shares beforehand anyway.
No, but I think there is a significance to it, and what it is that I believe that the Glazers wanted to use that small 10% shareholding that's quoted on the market as a benchmark to set the valuation of the company when they're touting around for a buyer. And because of the small number of shares being traded, I think it was probably quite easy to maintain the share price if you wanted to.
Right.
But I think under the current pressure, it isn't possible. So I think we're starting to now see something closer to what the market believes the value of the shares is.
Right.
And based on the current share price, you can work out, and oddly enough, it just works out almost like it's 10 times in pounds. In other words, $14 works out about 1.4 billion in terms of valuation. So that's where we are at the moment. We're about 1.4 billion in terms of that. But people argue in both directions that either undervalues or overvalues it, versus the market. And I think you'd only find out if you saw more shares floated, and ideally you didn't have the AB structure, which is going to distort it as well. In that scenario, you might get a bit more of a realistic idea of what the market believes the value of the club is. Of course, in my view, the club's worth much more to support, and I don't just mean emotionally. I mean because of the fact that if the fans feel they own the club and they're part of it, I think you get a lot more transactions with the club. People feel good about buying from the club.
Absolutely.
I mean, I made this argument in the meeting we had with Ed Woodward, and he was talking about why don't people spend money inside the stadium on drinks and so on, or not significantly, and he was comparing the figures in the US and saying his US investors, not the Glazers but other investors, were essentially surprised that we didn't generate more revenue, and he felt it was because they're not really interested in that, they just want to watch the game, and it's a different culture in America, and I think there's some truth in that, but I think the main thing is they don't want to give money to the Glazers, literally. And the point I made was go into Sam Platts or the Bishop Glaze or the Trafford or any of the pubs around the ground, they're rammed full of people buying drinks, and they pay more, and they're paying it to private businesses that have nothing to do with Manchester United. If Manchester United was their club and they owned a stake in it, I think people would feel, I don't want to give it to these other businesses, I want to give it to my football club.
Of course.
Tesco at the top of the road on Chester Road, if that was Tesco Manchester United and we owned the club, I'd shop there every week.
Absolutely.
But if it was now, I'd never shop there, because I wouldn't want to give them any money, the current owners, because of what they've done to the club. And so I think there is a massive potential benefit if you get the right ownership model, where you get everyone feeling like we're all working together, we're not being exploited or screwed by a group of owners that don't care about the club and are just using the club as a way to extract money from us.
Could use if it was Manchester United Tesco, you could use the club card to accrue points.
Well, I mean, these
pints inside the stadium.
Absolutely, these are the sort of reward schemes we've talked about. Ways that you could have an exit strategy that involved supporters getting shares in the club in return for transactions. But you've got to know that it is not just going to effectively fuel revenue for the current owners and not realistically give any opportunity for a change of ownership. There's got to be some kind of roadmap which they cannot exit from, they cannot divert from when they choose to. There's got to be a way that you can do that. I don't think that's impossible, but it's certainly complex. And I think probably we need to be in a slightly different position than we are now with the 10% on the market in order to start that process. But I think there are ways to do it.
And it's kind of like it strikes me as a virtuous circle as well, because the kind of topics that you're discussing also tie in with things like the standing section and what have you, because obviously one of the issues and why people, like you say, aside from not wanting to fund the glazers, is obviously the atmosphere sometimes can be lacking inside the ground. So things like the standing section would only reinforce what you're saying in terms of if the fans had a bigger stake in the club. And fans would want to be inside the ground more, the atmosphere will be better because it's the fans' club. So it kind of all ties in that respect.
Yeah, I think it does, and I might say something on the standing thing. I mean, I was amused to read some criticism in one of my favourite fanzines, Red Issue, and it was a misunderstanding really about something that had been reported in the press, which was that we were proposing to buy shares in the club that would give the Glazers money, and then in return we would get standing sections in the ground, and this wasn't what we were proposing at all.
Yeah.
What we were looking at, and it wasn't a proposal either, it had not even been discussed at committee level, it was just, you know, some ideas that were being knocked around in a discussion.
Yeah.
But the idea was, just for the sake of clarity on this, was that we were looking at the cost of something like implementing a standing section where you can't get any benefit for the club at the moment financially because you can only sell one place per seat as a rail seat, but you can stand there because it's much safer with the rail in there, but there's no increase in revenue. And the cost would be approximately £100 per seat.
Right.
So if you wanted to put 5,000 seats in, £500,000, something like that,
right,
that you'd need. And the argument has always been, well, why is any club going to do that when they don't get the revenue? And we said, well, how about if supporters wanted it, they could pay for it, but they don't pay for it and get nothing in return. They buy new shares in the club.
Yeah.
So what they do is the club issues shares to the value of 500,000.
Yeah.
The supporters buy those shares. The money doesn't go to the Glazers, it goes to the club. And this is different. If it was the Glazers shares, yes, they get the money.
Yeah, yeah.
But if it goes to the club,
yeah,
and the club have committed that money has to be spent on this safe standing area, we've got what we want. Now people will say, well, you've paid for it. Well, no, you haven't, because you bought shares.
Yeah.
And of course, if you wanted to, you could sell those shares immediately and get your money back, plus or minus any change in share price during that process.
Yeah.
So what it would mean is, we've got the safe standing area, the club didn't lose any money because the money came in from outside,
yeah,
and the fans got what they want, and they either keep the shares or they can choose to sell them if they wish. So I can't understand how anyone feels that is somehow feeding the Glazers. If those new shares are issued, the Glazers' holding is diluted accordingly. So they're in absolutely the same position they were in before.
Yeah.
If the club's worth 500,000 more, technically, their shareholding has gone down proportionately, so that they still have the same value of their shareholding. And so I think there was a misunderstanding there, and I think it's worth clarifying that.
Yeah. And obviously sort of neatly segues onto the issue of both standing section and safe standing. What's kind of the MUST have any stance in terms of supporting either, or are they directly supporters of either the standing section or safe standing?
I mean, safe singing section.
The singing section.
I think, certainly we have long supported safe standing, and we still do in terms of the rail seat solution. We're not talking about going back to the old terraces, and I don't believe that will ever happen. And I think what we're talking about is rail seats as an interim solution, and if everyone's comfortable with that, and I believe that the rail seats can meet the current ground regulations, so there's no need for a change in legislation. It's just about a club talking to a local council and making sure they're happy with it in terms of issuing this ground safety certificate. And we're in the process of negotiating with both those parties at this time to try and get that to come about.
Yeah.
But the second phase, if you wanted to then issue 2 tickets per seat in effect, and in actual fact with the rail seats they recommend 1.8 in order to create a little bit of free, a little bit of a buffer, because obviously people don't always distribute themselves absolutely evenly in these sections.
Okay.
But you would need a change in legislation for that, because clearly that would be a standing section,
Yeah.
because there aren't as many seats as there are people in there.
Yeah.
But I think that's much further down the line. But I think that could be a great solution. I've seen it at Dortmund and it's fantastic and it works there, and I don't see why it can't work in the UK, but it's going to take a bit of time to persuade politicians and authorities to change on that. But yeah, so I think the rail seats is something we can start on now.
Yeah.
In terms of the singing section, I think the singing section, I think it's worth trying these things. I don't think it's the long-term solution personally, because I think that the core of the problem in terms of atmosphere is about issues like, it's not just the demographics of who's in there, It's about how they feel.
Yeah.
Because singing has to be coming out spontaneously. And I think we've heard it increasingly over the years that people are having to try and work to create an atmosphere.
Yeah.
And they're trying to tell other people what to do. And that isn't the way it should work. It should work because everyone feels good, they feel they're in a kind of a community.
Yeah.
And you naturally got that on the old Stretford end because people can move to their mates in a standing section. So I think the migration, unreserved seats or rail seats or standing, is the most important thing. Not just because you're standing, but because it allows movement.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think there's just things like ticket pricing are important because it makes you feel a certain way. If you were paying 20 quid to watch United, 10 quid to watch United,
Yeah.
then you're just a supporter who's there. You don't feel like you're being screwed by the club. If you're paying 100 quid, don't you think people will start to go, Rooney, you're getting paid 300 grand, why should I be, singing for you? I'm going to sit and fold my arms or I'm start complaining.
Yeah.
Get your act together, we paid for these, we paid 100 quid for these seats.
Yeah.
So taking those two extremes, you can see that for me, essentially, if you plot ticket price versus a transition from supporter to customer, that's what happens. As the price goes up, people turn themselves into customers.
Yeah.
Customers expect a level of service, supporters want to give to the club. You're not going to give when you're being screwed. And so I think that is the most important thing.
Yeah.
But in the end, it comes down to the ownership, because these things happen when you have the right ownership. That's why you've got it in Germany. You've got standing, people can drink a pint in the ground,
Yeah.
people get cheap tickets. All those things happen in Germany. The
Yeah.
atmosphere is fantastic.
Yeah.
That's because of the ownership, because the fans have enough influence over the club
Yeah.
that there's a cooperation there. And so that's why we've always felt that the ultimate answer is a different ownership model.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're not prepared to work on dealing with some of the symptoms in the short term.
Yes.
So the singing section for me is a short-term potential solution.
Yeah.
I think it's controversial, in particular what happened with K-Stand and so on recently, where people were initially, at least it appeared, being forced out of their seats. And I think that wasn't the right approach. I think in the end what happened was most people were offered the option to stay, but it just became something that created negativity and tension. So
Yeah.
that was unfortunate, and I think it worked much better in the away stand anyway, in the away section anyway,
Yeah.
when it's first trialled in that match. It probably didn't help that the result was what it was before, but it was. I think it was successful, but there are arguments that if you create a singing section, you draw everyone from other parts of the ground, and they lose their atmosphere.
Yeah.
But I do think that the solution is about creating pockets of critical mass, and so maybe it's not just one or two sections. It's about allowing people to be together with their mates. I think you need groups, 8 to 10 people in little blocks that are the ones who create the song and get it to that level where it spreads. But all these things are important, and most of all I think it's how you feel the attitude is between you and the club.
Yeah.